Hi everyone, Levi Thompson. I am an associate professor in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and I am here today to talk about the subject of the Abbasid Caliphate. I'm going to start explaining the terms that we are looking at, just those two words, Abbasid and Caliphate, and this will be our starting point. First of all, Caliphate. This term comes from an Arabic word, caliph, khalifa, that goes back to the time just after the Prophet Muhammad died. The Abbasid Caliphate was not the first of the caliphates. There were several. The first caliphate starts just after the Prophet's death, and it is called the Rashidun Caliphate, the rightly guided caliphs. And who is a caliph? A caliph is the leader of the Muslim community following the death of the Prophet. When the Prophet was alive, he was the leader. Then there was a crisis after he died. Who is going to lead the Muslim faithful into the future? The decision was made that there would be the establishment of an institution called the Caliphate, with a caliph as its leader. Now, what exactly the caliph did and what his responsibilities were, what he was able to do with the community does change over time. But for our purposes, caliphate means the leader of the Muslim community. Abbasid, here we have a term that comes from a name of one of the Prophet's relatives, his paternal half-uncle, Al-Abbas, that's his name. The Abbasid Caliphate was led by descendants of Abbas. That's where we get that name. So now we have those two terms defined, finally. So when does the Abbasid Caliphate exist? The Prophet Muhammad dies in 632. I've already mentioned we had the Rashidun Caliphate that comes just after that moment. The Rashidun Caliphate exists from 632 to 661, at which point we have another caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate. This is another group of leaders within Islam, descended from someone named Umayyah. The Umayyad Caliphate exists from 661 to 750, at which point the Abbasids and their supporters rise up against the Umayyads, coming from an area that is called Khorasan in what is now Iran. They rise up with black flags. The flags are just pitch black, and they march against the Umayyads and take over. This Abbasid Caliphate is actually, of all the caliphates that existed, it's the one that most people would be familiar with somewhat if they knew a little bit of Islamic or Middle Eastern history, because later scholars look back on the Abbasid Caliphate as the quote-unquote golden age of Islam. Why is that? Under the Abbasids, we saw major advances in philosophy, in sciences, in literary output. And if you've heard of the 1001 Nights, those stories are usually situated historically during the Abbasid Caliphate, specifically during the rule of Harun al-Rashid, who was a caliph at the peak of Abbasid authority within the Islamic world. The Abbasids were situated initially in Iraq. They started out with their capital in Kufa. They were there 750 to 762, and then they created a new capital in Baghdad. They were situated in Baghdad from 762 to 836. This is really the height of Abbasid power and authority. This is when the famous Caliph Harun al-Rashid was alive. This is that golden age. Following Baghdad, they built a new capital in a place called Samarra. The Abbasids were situated there in Samarra from 836 to the end of the 9th century, at which point they went back to Baghdad, where they continued to rule until 1258, when that city was sacked by the Mongols. The Abbasid period had its ups and downs. Just to give you a picture of what the political and military situation was during the Abbasid period, we see, even during the early Abbasid years, more dependence of the caliph upon Turkish soldiers who had not really been a part of the Islamic armies during the initial Islamic conquests. And the Islamic conquest took place dating all the way back to the time the Prophet was alive and through to the Rashidun caliphs and the Umayyads as well, spreading Islam across the known world at the time. And this dependence on Turkish soldiers was also, there was a parallel change within the core of Islamic society with more influence from Iran. As I mentioned, the Abbasids found their power base in Khorasan, which is in Iran. So you see the importation of an earlier court culture that didn't really exist in the caliphate until the Abbasids came to power. And we see some Persian influence trickling in from the Sasanian period. And later thinkers look back on these aspects of the Abbasid approach to governance as sort of denaturing what had been a more pure Islam that was then getting influenced by outside actors like the Sasanians, who had been enemies of the Muslims early on, like the Turks, who were not involved in early Islamic conquests and only came into the realm much later. This changes the ethnic makeup of the caliphate, and eventually we see a dispersal of power starting to happen more under the Abbasids than we ever saw with the Umayyads or the Rashidun caliphs who came earlier. And it came to a head by the late 9th and then 10th century. The caliph, who used to hold a lot of political and military importance and power, becomes more of a figurehead who does not actually hold any power himself and rather depends on other types of political leaders that emerge during the Abbasid period, including some terms that you may have heard before, one of those being sultan. So we have the emergence of different sultanates. There is the Turkic Seljuk Sultanate that emerges under the Abbasids that really takes over military leadership within the Islamic world, thus shunting aside the Abbasid Caliph and turning him, as I mentioned before, into more of a figurehead. This political and military fracturing creates a situation where there are sometimes power vacuums and outside actors have an easier time coming in to the Islamic world with military campaigns. And this is what leads then to the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, which brings us to the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. Thank you.